Hello, I'm Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK Hobby Imports and Distributors, and welcome to episode 6 of this End of the War in Europe. In this episode, we will again jump forward to March and April 1945, with the Red Army poised to attack the last natural defences line east of Berlin for the Germans, the River Oder and the Seelow Heights. In the west, the Allies have crossed the Rhine and were now pushing towards the Elbe with massive forces. The Germans are still a powerful force. Even this late in the war, 7 million men under arms, but now spread all over Europe. They've got divisions in Norway, Denmark, Western Front, Eastern Front. But the rail system by now was completely bust or under constant air attack. This resulted in the Germans not being able to get many of these divisions back to defend Berlin. The German army was still on the offensive in Hungary, using the best of its remaining Tiger tanks, including King Tigers, trying to stem the Red Army in March 1945. But by the end of March 1945, the front line on the Eastern Front was basically run the length of the River Oder. After the Red Army had advanced some 450 kilometres west, the Soviet High Command called the offensive to a halt just 43 miles from Berlin, which basically was undefended at the time. Continuing German resistance further north had to be overcome around the northern flank, so the main advance to Berlin would not start until April 1945. With a broad offensive over the Oder. The numbers are mind-boggling. Today, with 3 main Soviet fronts, or army groups: Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front, Marshal Rozovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front, and Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front, totaling 2.3 million men, 6,500 tanks and assault guns, 41,000 artillery guns, 3,000 truck-mounted Katyusha rockets and 7,500 aircraft. The Germans had about 36 divisions, and many not really fully equipped, with about 1,500 guns and AFVs. They had 9,000 artillery guns though, and 2,000 aircraft. Many were just unserviced or not moving for lack of fuel. We will concentrate on Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front attack over the Oder and taking of the Seelow Heights by i.e. the last natural defence line before Berlin. The Soviet halt near the Oder to sort out the northern flanks gave the Germans time to rush reinforcement, including tanks pulled from the west, as mentioned in our last Battle of the Bulge video. The Germans had some 14 kind of badly equipped divisions of about 100,000 men and about 500 AFVs and a few thousand guns, but all were placed in good defensive positions on and around the Seelow Heights, looking down at this big flat floodplain back to the Oder, where the Red Army would have to come through on the attack. General Gotthard Heinrici, Army Group Vistula's commander, consists of the 9th Army, the 3rd Panzer Army commanded by Asso von Manteuffel, the general who commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Battle of Bulge. Zhukov had over 1 million men and 3,000 tanks and thousands of guns. But the Germans only put a thin screen of troops on the Oder, and the main defences were on the Seelow Heights. The Germans flooded the area between the Heights and the Oder to make the Soviet advance difficult once they got over the actual river. Early on the 16th of April, the massive Red Army barrage began with 500,000 shells and rockets in just 30 minutes. But captured Soviet prisoners revealed the date of the barrage, thus the Germans pulled most of their troops back from the mass bombardment area. That made the ground actually more impossible, and the soggy ground just basically soaked up the shells. Zhukov sent masses of infantry once the barrage was over, only to be mowed down by well-placed German machine guns. The Germans then hit the Red Army infantry with artillery, causing many more casualties. Zhukov committed early to his armoured reserves before the infantry had broken through the heights across the canal, just at the base of the heights. But hundreds of tanks were now trapped on the other side of the canal and were picked off one by one by German Panther tanks, including the latest IS-2 tank. The Soviets lost over 150 AFVs, including 50 of the latest massive IS-2 tanks. Weight of numbers by the early on the 17th started to come into play, and the town of Seelow Heights was captured by Soviet tanks. The Germans fought hard to hold the Red Army, but suffered many casualties. The Soviets were losing many more, but they just kept pumping more and more infantry and tanks into the battle. The main road from the River Oder to Berlin, Reichsstrasse number 1 or Ein, would give the Soviets a clear run to Berlin if they could take the Soviet Seelow Heights. The Germans held most of the heights on the 18th of April 1945. But after stubborn German resistance, their divisions were starting to collapse. The Soviet 5th Shock Army had busted through the German second line of defence and were actually attacking the German third line of defence. By the end of the 18th, the second day of the Seelow Heights battle, the last major obstacle before Berlin was collapsing, and by the 19th, the 1st Belarusian front had broken through the last line of defence and were in open country and racing towards Berlin. The battle for the Seelow Heights had cost the Soviet Union upwards of 30,000 dead, the Germans 15,000 killed. But the road was now open to Berlin, and the other fronts had started to push north of Berlin and south of the city in a pincer movement. The Western Allies by April 1945 surrounded the Ruhr Pocket, again after a pincer movement by 21st Army Group and US 12th Army Group. This was the last major engagement in the West. The towns and cities such as Duisburg, Essen, Dusseldorf, Dortmund and Hamm were all trapped in this pocket, and the 21st Army Group and the 12th Army Group, or US 12th Army Group, closed the pincer at Lippstadt on the 1st of April 1945. Inside the pocket were about 350,000 German troops commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, but many were even unarmed. So town by town, section by section, the US 9th, 1st and newly arrived 15th Army took apart the Ruhr Pocket. The battle lasted 14 days and cost the Allies some 10,000 casualties. The Germans lost about 10,000 dead, but at the same time 320,000 prisoners of war. The German economic heartland had been crushed. Goebbels stated, "There is no more coal coming from the Ruhr." Field Marshal Montgomery, 21st Army Group, pushed northwest towards Hamburg, Denmark and the Baltics. Patton's US 3rd Army were pushing to southern Germany towards Austria. And in the west, the German armies were collapsing fast and in most cases happy to do so, knowing that the end was coming. Montgomery's ambition after crossing the Rhine was to expect priority in fuel and supplies and to keep the US 9th Army under his command and drive towards Berlin. And this was backed by Churchill, but the Supreme Allied Commander in the West, Eisenhower, did not want this. Eisenhower understood that in 1944, the Allies had already agreed the boundary lines for the occupation of Germany, and Berlin was 100 miles inside the Soviet area. So Ike did not want to lose thousands and thousands of Western Allied troops on a burnt-out, bombed-out hulk of a city just to hand it back to the Soviet Union. General George C. Marshall agreed with Ike and that it would be better to call a halt on a natural area such as the Elbe, with the Western Allies on the West Bank and the Soviet on the East Bank. This would prevent a disastrous clash of two advancing armies clashing by accident. So the Red Army would take Berlin. This decision has been debated ever since. We shall now look at the battle for Berlin. Just like the battle for the Ruhr Pocket, the Red Army would be first surround Berlin in a pincer movement and cut off any relief and prevent a breakout of major forces. This would be two large Polish armies, 1st and 2nd Polish Army, as well as the Red Armies, 1st and 2nd Belarusian Front and the 1st Ukrainian Front. The two maps behind me show the main preparation and the massive forces in place, and the second map shows Berlin totally surrounded and the Germans trying to counterattack. The first part of the battle we have already covered, which is the crossing of the Oder and the battle for the Seelow Heights, plus the Soviet and Polish forces doing a pincer movement to surround the city of Berlin. On the 12th of April, against the advice of his commanders, Adolf Hitler decided to stay in the city in the Führer bunker, and Berlin was under massive daylight attacks by United States Army Air Force B-17s and RAF tactical Mosquitoes for almost 36 days. We're now showing a clip from Masters of the Air showing the scale of the bombing on Berlin. Stalin did not think the Western Allies would hand over any agreed territory back to the Soviets. So he massed attacked on a broad front, taking what he thought was, in his mind, Soviet future territory and the future East Germany. And this included Berlin. Berlin was defended by not much more than 60,000 German troops, many young and old, backed by 1 or 2 SS divisions and a few tanks and assault guns. There were strong German units in the area, but now were cut out the main city. The Soviet assault forces comprised of nearly 500,000 tough frontline soldiers. On the 20th of April 1945, Hitler's birthday, masses of Soviet artillery opened up on Berlin and would not stop until the city surrendered. On the 22nd of April, Hitler was in the rage of rages, berating the generals for letting him down and their failure to relieve Berlin after a series of failed counterattacks. These had been repulsed by the Red Army and Polish forces. General Jodl suggested moving 12th Army Corps from the Elbe, as the Germans already knew the US Army would not cross the river, as the Germans had actually captured part of what was known as the Eclipse document. But no matter what they did, no matter what intelligence they knew, now it was going to be just too late. On the 23rd, the Soviet 5th Shock Army, backed up by the 1st Guards Tank Army, started to assault Berlin from the southeast. By the way, we have often mentioned Guards infantry and tank armies and other units. If a Red Army rifle or tank unit distinguished itself in battle, it was given the prefix Guards, after the Red Guards that defended Petrograd and Moscow during the March Revolution. These two armies overcame German counterattacks and were soon on the Berlin S-Bahn, the internal railway system. Some of the most vicious fighting was carried out by foreign SS volunteers, especially the French, who now it was a case of fight hard and be killed or captured and be killed. In fact, one of the very last Knight's Crosses awarded by Hitler was to a French SS Unterscharführer volunteer for knocking out 6 Soviet tanks early in the day. On the 25th of April, on the banks of the Elbe, Soviet forces met with troops of the US Army's 69th Infantry Division on the east bank of the Elbe, with the official meeting held on the 27th called the Handshake of Torgau. The British Second Army met the Soviets on the 29th of April, again on the Elbe, but this time further north towards the Baltic. By the 26th of April, the Soviets had fought their way to Tempelhof Airport, and 2 German divisions were holding the Soviet attacks from the southeast part of the city, but were facing massive forces and point-blank Red Army artillery, including their latest version of their massive assault guns. Within another 24 hours, the Germans would have to fall back to the central or Zentrum redoubt, where all the main Nazi buildings were turned into fortresses manned by fanatical SS. By the 28th, the 3rd Shock Army had crossed, I think it's the Molke Bridge, into the centre of Berlin from the northwest, but they had no direct artillery support or assault guns as the bridges had been damaged. And on the 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun and had a nice little reception, but Soviet artillery was falling all around them, and the 8th Guards Army was fighting across the Tiergarten where the Berlin Zoo is. On the 30th, the Red Army had a good amount of assault guns and artillery now into the centre of Berlin, and at 0600 hours started to attack the Reichstag building that had not been used since the fire of 1933, but now turned into a warren of small fortresses, plus supported by 12.8 centimetre German guns on the Zoo flag towers. On the afternoon of the 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in the bunker, located, I think, kind of southeast of the Reichstag. And the control of the German Reich was passed to Admiral Dönitz. It would take 24 hours of vicious room-to-room fighting for the Red Army to take the Reichstag with gun barrels blazing red. But early on the 2nd of May, Soviet soldiers climbed high on the building and placed a massive Soviet flag, which is one of the iconic pictures of World War II. Please see behind this classic photo of the soldier waving the massive Soviet Union flag. Around the Tiergarten, the last German Tiger tanks and troops fought it out with the Soviet Red 3rd Shock Army, but were now completely overwhelmed, and the German officers informed the Soviets of Hitler's death and their willingness to surrender. But Goebbels was now the Chancellor of the Reich and absolutely refused. But in the afternoon of the 1st, Goebbels and his wife killed their own children with poisoned chocolates, then killed themselves. Thus, the senior German officers were now free to surrender, but delayed this for about 24 hours, giving time for some of the units to break out and head toward the western lines rather than be captured by the Soviets.
All hostilities on land, on sea, or in the air by German forces in the above areas to cease at 0800 hours British double summer time on Saturday the 5th of May 1945. This instrument of surrender is independent of, without prejudice to, and will be superseded by any general instrument of surrender imposed by or on behalf of the Allied powers and applicable to Germany and the German armed forces as a whole.
Yes. Between the 3rd of May 1945 and the 9th of May, German forces started to surrender, but were spread over a large area, hence it took them some time for the final Germans to give up. The Battle of Berlin, across the Red Army, from the Oder to the fall of Berlin, some 400,000 casualties, of which 90,000 were dead. The Germans lost close to 1 million in the last month of war alone, including 500,000 prison war just in the east. Here I've got ICM's latest model. It's literally just arrived in April 2025, and it's actually Monty's Caravan, and it's the actual vehicle that was parked next to the tent where the Germans actually surrendered. And down here's another little kit you can buy to go with it, which is Montgomery again, with I think General Dempsey and General Crayer, so he's commander of his 2nd Army and 1st Canadian Army. The Germans surrendered to all the major powers by the 8th and 9th of May 1945, including the Soviets with Zhukov in Berlin, thus bringing to end the European part of the most destructive war in human history. In the aftermath part of this series, episode 7, I will talk a little about the peoples of the Netherlands who were left to starve at the end of the Second World War, and the Allies discovering the horrors of the Nazi regime.